Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's Dynamics 365 Tech Talk, where today's topic is Warehouse Management Configuration Deep Dive. My name is Evan, and I'll be your moderator today. We are broadcasting this web conference through Teams Live events, and the audio can be heard through your device speakers. Today's web conference is being recorded on behalf of the Microsoft Corporation, and by participating in the session using Microsoft Teams, your name, email address, phone number, and/or title may be viewable by other session participants. If you do not consent to being a part of a recorded session, please disconnect at this time. The recording will be available on the Tech Talks Community Dynamics page within 5 business days. If you have questions for the presenters or need support, please use the Q&A panel located on the right side of your screen. Our presenters will be responding to your questions throughout the event. Thank you for your patience during these announcements. Now let's get started. Presenting for us today from Microsoft, we have Nicole Gump, Senior Program Manager. Nicole, over to you.
Thanks, Evan. Welcome to our next session in our supply chain management for Dynamics 365 Tech Talk series. Today, as Evan said, we're going to go through a warehouse management configuration deep dive. So we are going to cover our 3 core configurations that we need to set up when using the warehouse management module. So please note that today's session is meant to be a broad overview of these configurations, their definitions and their functionality and their uses, but we will not necessarily cover any specific business requirements or use cases for any specific industry. But please put your questions into the Q&A and we will address them throughout, as Evan mentioned, or at the end, should have some time to take some live Q&A as well. So let's get started. So our agenda for today. So we will start by defining our 3 core configurations. Then we will describe their functionality. And then I will provide some tips and tricks for working with these configurations. And as we are going through the tips and tricks, we'll also be working in a live environment with Kintoso demo data. So let's begin with just defining what we consider our core configurations for warehouse management. The first configuration is our wave templates. So these define the processes that are performed by the system in order to create work. Our second core configuration is the work templates, and the work templates define the structure of our work. Think of these as the workflow or the steps that need to be completed in order to complete a transaction. And lastly, we have our location directives. So these define the business logic of our work, or what we consider the what and how many and where of the process. So now that we've defined our terms, let's talk a little bit about the functionality of each of these configurations. So in this section, I have provided a graphic that hopefully gives all of you visual learners a different way to think about some of these configurations. So let's start with the wave templates. So we defined these as the processes that are executed to create work in the system. So what I have depicted here is this funnel, and the funnel is really meant to represent the allocation step in our wave, which is really the step that's doing the most thinking or processing of that business logic. So the circles that are in the funnel are meant to represent the inputs to that allocation process. So We have our demand lines. So these would be our source orders, our sales orders, transfer orders if we're talking about shipping, or maybe a production order or a Kanban if we're talking about manufacturing. So along with those demand lines, the system is also evaluating our other two core configurations of work templates and location directives. So all together, those inputs get put into our funnel when the system is doing that allocation step in the wave, and the output ultimately is our work transaction. So really think of that wave process as the engine in our warehouse management module that's really doing all of the business logic processing and creating our work transactions for us. So if we move to the work templates, we defined these as the structure of our work or the workflow, meaning in the work templates, we have to define the individual steps that need to be completed in order to complete a work transaction. So in this graphic, I have depicted 3 different types of work that might have different structures. So on the left-hand column, I have depicted purchase orders, which might have a very simple flow of one pick from our inbound dock and just one put into our storage in our warehouse. So one thing to point out, as we're working with work templates, if we have a work order type that is using pick and put steps, those always have to be paired together. We cannot just create a work template with a pick line or just a put line. You will get a warning message in the system, and we'll see that later, that tells you that the pick and the put has to be in a pair. So if we move to the middle column for sales order type of work, we see a bit more complex structure where we have 2 different sets of pick and put. So in this case, our workflow looks like we are picking from our storage location, and then we are putting to some type of intermediate location before we ship. So that might be a staging location. And then after, whether it's a period of time it needs to pass as we're accumulating inventory in that staging location, or perhaps we are just contacting carriers to rate and route our load that inventory is going to go on. Whatever is happening in that staging location, after that activity is completed, we have another set of work instructions here that says we are going to then pick that inventory back up from staging and move it to our outbound dock or our final shipping location. So for this particular sales order workflow, we've got those 2 pick-put pairs. And then on the right-hand column, I included cycle counting because this one is not a work type that uses the pick and put structure. It actually just has a single line of work type counting to define that activity. So those are 3 different structures that you may see in the work templates. And then let's talk about our location directives. I'm going to spend a bit of time here, and I've got an example of this on the next slide, because we find as solution architects and certainly in working with our support teams at Microsoft, that we get a lot of questions specifically around the setups and the execution of location directives. So I want to make sure that this is really clear and we give a good example here. So I have chosen this graphic for the location directives because the actual form in the system is also broken down into 3 parts. So I like that this graphic is also has 3 rows across. So on the left-hand column, I have actually named the 3 rows with what they are named in the system, in the fast tabs of the form. So at the header level or in the top of the grid, we have the location directives. And in the graphic on the right-hand side, I have described the particular business logic that is happening in that section. So when we look at the header, it is defining the what for our process. What are we doing with this location directive? When we move to the middle part of the grid, which is our lines fast tab in the form, we are then defining how many, so the quantity and which units apply to this location directive. Then as we move to the bottom of the grid, which is our location directive actions fast tab in the form, in the system, that is then defining the where of our business logic. So I'm going to give an example of this that might help clarify a bit further. So in the example, I have moved that business logic descriptor to the left-hand side so that we can keep that in mind, and then put an example into our graphic. So let's talk through how this might work in our example. So at the header, we've got the what of the location directive. And in this case, this is an example from a sales order type of work, just to clarify. So what I am telling the system, what I am doing is a pick from warehouse 61. That's the what of my header. And then as I move below, another reason that I liked this particular graphic for this example is because it does show that we have this hierarchical relationship between the parts of the form. So between the header and the middle grid here, we have a one-to-many relationship. And then between the middle grid and the bottom grid, we have another one-to-many relationship. So it's very important when we talk about the sequence number that is identified in the middle and bottom sections, that's very important, and I've included that in the example here. So if we start with our what of the pick from warehouse 61, and then we move into our 2 sequences that could happen in the middle grid, which is defining the how many. So our quantity as well as our units that quantity applies to. So I have told my directive here in the example that the first sequence that I want you to evaluate is if I have between 0 and 2 full pallets of inventory that I need to pick, meaning that whatever quantity is on my sales order line, the demand, is converted into 0 to 2 full pallets of inventory, then I want it to look at the where in the bottom of the directive and direct the user to go to a floor location only. That's the only place I want them to be directed to. So let's say that my item that I'm picking on my sales order has a unit conversion of 100 eaches to 1 full pallet. So if I am picking only 75 units that are on my sales order line, then that first sequence that I just went through in the example does not apply because I do not have at least 100 units to make 1 full pallet. So in that example, we would be directed to the other part of this hierarchy when we get to the how many part of the directive in the center. It does not meet the criteria for a full pallet. So we move to the second sequence, which basically says if it's any quantity, so I've put just 0 to a very open-ended number of 9,999,999 eaches, then my 75 units from my example fall in this category now. So now I can come down to the where do I pick those 75 units from at the bottom grid. And you can see that, again, I have got a sequence, so that one-to-many relationship between the eaches and where I can look for it. So in this example, I have told the directive, first, go look for those 75 eaches from the item's fixed location. So if it has an assigned location that I typically pick this item from, I want to first check there, just for picking efficiencies. But if that fixed location either does not have sufficient inventory, maybe there's only 50 units sitting there, or maybe it's empty and we have not replenished it, then I have given my directive a second sequence to check for where I might be able to pick this inventory and still fulfill the demand, because I don't want this allocation to fail. And I still want the system to create picking work for me, even if that fixed location does not have sufficient inventory. So I have given it a second option of looking in my bulk storage for those 75 eaches if the system cannot find them in the fixed location. So this example hopefully helps not only clarify the business logic that is being evaluated in the form, but also the relationship between the parts of the form and how the sequences are working when it's being evaluated. And keep in mind as well, and we'll jump into the system and look at this form live, but as the wave is processing and it's going through that allocation step, if we remember back to that funnel, it is taking every demand line that's in that wave, and it's going through this logic in the location directives for every single line that you're trying to fulfill. So this logic is being evaluated many times over, potentially within a single wave. So the way that we configure this is important, and we'll come back to that in the tips and tricks as well. So let's move in to our tips and tricks section. And we're going to start with our wave templates. So the first tip that we have applies pretty universally unless you have some specific business requirements to manually manage your wave process. Typically, we do not see that as being a requirement. So we would recommend that you automate the wave creation process, the processing of the wave at release to warehouse, and the release of the wave after it's been created, which means that the work that was generated from the wave is not blocked and it can be immediately processed. And you can actually see in the screenshot on the right-hand side that the parameters to automate those processes are these three that are checked here, and we'll look at them in the system as well. And the second one alludes to what we were just talking about with the location directives and how they are evaluated for every single demand line that you have in your wave. So that's all happening in that allocation step, that funnel that we showed earlier. So because that is potentially a really heavy performance task on the system, we do have the option to parallelize that allocation step in the wave. And again, you are not able to do this if for some reason you have a business requirement where you are manually managing and releasing your waves. However, if you can put your waves in a batch process, we would enable that and then allow this particular step. So it's just one of these methods that's being done within the wave process. But again, it's the most heavy lift on the system to execute. So for this particular step, we are able to configure parallel tasks or multi-threading, you may hear it referred to as well, so that you can gain some efficiencies in the processing time of the overall wave. And then one more tip here for the wave templates is maybe less common, but still very useful. So if you are using what I called the add-in tasks here, or basically the non-standard methods in the wave, so that would be our containerization or replenishment, that you can go in to the wave processing method setup and make this task repeatable, which allows you to add it to the wave processing methods more than one time. So that way, if you were doing an automatic, containerization process, perhaps for packing, that the system is able to evaluate multiple different containerization templates instead of just one. Because if you do not make these methods repeatable, you can only add them to your wave once, which then means you can only link them to their corresponding templates once as well. So if you've got multiple criteria, say you need to create boxes of inventory from loose eaches, but then also create full pallets from those boxes, then I would need a containerization method in my wave twice to evaluate how do I create boxes and then how do I create pallets. So if I'm only able to put that method in once, I would not be able to accomplish that auto containerization requirement for boxes and pallets. All right, so let's take a look at the system and we'll go through each of those tips. Okay, I had a direct link to opening up my wave templates in the system, but I'll go ahead and just point out quickly where these are. So under warehouse management, under setup, and under waves, we have wave templates here as the first form under this section. So that will bring you here. Our first tip was about automating the creation, so that's this parameter here, and then automating the processing of the wave. So when you release an order to the warehouse, that triggers this wave to begin. And so we want to automate the processing by checking this parameter here. And then the automation of the release is this third parameter here. And again, when we say release, I know that's a bit confusing because we use the term release to warehouse when we talk about warehouse management, but this actually means releasing the work that was created by the wave so that it is not blocked for processing. So if you automate this, whatever work is generated can be immediately executed by your users. So that is the first tip. Let's move to, we talked about being able to multi-thread or parallelize our allocation step in the wave. So if we're looking at this shipping template, that would apply again to sales orders and transfer orders. And I'm looking at just this first one in the list is for my warehouse 24 in my USMF legal entity. This is all Contoso data, so you can certainly take a look at it yourself as well. I see the allocation step here. So in order to speed this step up, if I've got really large waves, this especially would be, if you're only processing a batch of orders, maybe once overnight or maybe a couple of times a day. And so you've got a bulk of your demand being evaluated in one single task, then this is certainly going to help you speed up that processing time. So a couple of things that you need to do to enable that wave parallelization is to go into the warehouse management setup and the warehouse management parameters or the module parameters form. And you'll see under the general tab, under the wave processing fast tab, we have this process waves in batch parameter that needs to be enabled. And when you enable that, you can also select the default wave processing batch group here that would be used. And then the other thing that you want to do once that is enabled is to go to warehouse management, and under waves and wave process methods, you want to find that allocation step. And you'll see that when I select that, I had an extra button that was enabled in the header of my form that says task configuration. If I click another method in here, you'll see that it is disabled for every other method. So right now, this only applies to the allocation step. And again, that's because we find that this is the step that is taking the longest to run. But I click on the allocation and I click on task configuration, and that allows me to define for a particular warehouse. So this might be, my main distribution center that has the bulk of my transactional volume. So I set it up maybe just for this warehouse, and maybe I have some other smaller warehouses in my network that I'm not as worried about the processing time. So I don't necessarily have to set up every warehouse here, but I could, right? I could add an additional warehouse in my network to this form as well. So you just select the warehouse. You tell it this is maximum number of batch tasks or threads that we're using. And you can define a specific batch group. So maybe instead of it using the default one from the module parameters, we may define different batch groups, even just for the particular warehouses if we really have that complex of a distribution network and high enough transactional volume to necessitate that. So I might select a different batch group there for my other warehouse. So once that is configured, so again, we're just in the configuration of the wave process method. We went to allocate wave and configured the task to tell it how many threads it can use. And we have enabled the processing of waves in batch from our warehouse management module parameters. So now if we go back and look at our wave template for warehouse 24 or for warehouse 61, because I just set that up as well. When we release an order to the warehouse and our wave template is triggered, it's going to automatically create my wave and process it. It's going to go through all of these methods. And when it hits this allocate wave step, it's now going to be able to process in as many threads as I defined in that wave process method. So that should be a noticeable performance improvement in your wave processing time if you set this up. Okay, and then ultimately it's going to create work, and then it's automatically going to release that work based on my setup. So let's talk about one other tip that we defined, which was being able to make our kind of non-standard or these add-in methods repeatable. So you'll see here, this is another setup that we do from the wave process method. So you'll see that I have the containerization step flagged as make method repeatable. I'm going to turn this off because I want to show you the default behavior, and then we will turn it back on to see the difference. So in our wave template, I've got these methods that are they're not added by default when you create a new wave template. But if I want to add this containerization step in to try some auto containerization, I can. You'll notice it's just asking me to define the wave step code. That is the link that would tie it to that external template to evaluate your criteria that I mentioned. That setup is a bit outside the scope of this discussion, but just I want to make sure that we're aware that that's what it's used for. So you'll see here that because this method is not repeatable, I just turned that parameter off. that when I added containerization to my methods, I now no longer see it as an option to select over here. However, if I would go back to my wave process methods setup and make containerization repeatable again and save that setup, I can now go back to my wave templates. And now I see that even though I have a containerization step already, that I also have it available as an option again, and I can add the containerization step in twice. And I can continue to do that, right? So again, the example we gave earlier was, I might have a wave step code that is linked to a container build template for boxes, in the first sequence here. And then as it evaluates containerization again, I may have a different step code defined for a different container build template that is trying to create full pallets out of the boxes it created in this step. So that is how you would achieve that. You have to first make this method repeatable. All right, so let's switch back to our tips and tricks and let's move on to work templates. So in our work templates, we want to talk about leaving gaps in our sequence numbers. When we say sequence numbers, we mean the actual sequence number of the header of the work template. You'll see in my screenshot here, that's sequence 3, but we will talk about that when we get into the system a little bit more for an example. The next tip would be to make sure that if you're using work pools and work priorities to help manage the allocation of your work to your users, so that workforce management, that you go ahead and assign the default values for those on your work templates, because it's going to save your warehouse supervisor or manager, who's ever managing that allocation of the work to the users. It's going to save them a lot of time and having to do that assignment manually. And then also on the work templates, when we do have a more complex structure, like we showed in the example for the sales order, and that's also what I'm showing here in the screenshot, a sales order with 2 pick and put pairs. So we've got a staging activity or an intermediate location that our workflow is going to before we ultimately put this to the final location, that we have this stop work flag that we can check to basically direct the workflow on the actual warehouse mobile application. So we'll talk about that example as well. So let's switch to the system so we can talk about these in a little more detail. So for the work templates, again, just to show where this is at, under warehouse management, setup, work templates, that will take you to this form here. We have got our work type drop down at the top. So if we look in here, we've got all the different work types that we might be working with in warehouse management that we would set up these work templates for. It is always going to default to the sales order work type. So just keep in mind if you're doing configuration and you're working with other types that you'll want to go ahead and switch this first. So I could switch to transfer issue, and that's going to show me my transfer picking work templates that are in the system. So you will see here, and let me switch back. We've got a few more examples in the sales order side. If I look up here at the top, the first tip that we gave was about the sequence numbers. You'll see that we've got 6, 8, 9, 10, 11. We don't really have a gap in the sequence numbers. We do have a gap between 6 and 8. There's only one number there, but no gaps between 8, 9, 10, 11. As you start to create work templates for the same type of work, so for sales orders, the system is just going to automatically, create. So if I click new here, it's going to give me the next number in the sequence. And while you can leave it like that, the problem with it is that if I need to create a new template that needs to be sequenced between some of these other templates. So if I look at, so I've got for warehouse 51, I've got to pick shipping, and I've got to pick to stage. If I were creating a new work template that needed to be evaluated in between these two, so I've got some particular criteria that I wanted the system to evaluate after this one and before this one, then I wouldn't have the ability to do that without resequencing all of the templates that are here. So that is why we suggest that you put the gaps in the sequence numbers. So if right now I've got through 10, so I can't start with 10, but if I were to start with, let's say 15, and I leave a gap of 5, so maybe I go by 5, so the next one would be 20, and then I would have 25, right? And I could go through, and if all of my sequence numbers looked like this, 10, 15, 20, 25, now if I have that same requirement of needing to create a new template for warehouse 51 that needs to go between 20 and 25, I now have a gap to do that. I could create a template that is, say, 22, and that could be, 51, we'll just call it test. And now that can go between 20 and 25 because I left myself a gap in the sequence numbers. And the reason that that's important is because unlike, even the line section of this form, you'll see we've got move up and move down arrows. We do not have those at the header level. So you cannot just create a new template, let it assign the next sequential number, and then move it up and down in your list. This is really kind of the workaround for that. So leave yourself some gaps in the sequence numbers. And then this is especially important, it shouldn't apply so much after you're live or in later stages of your implementation, but certainly early on as you're in design and you're configuring and testing the system, you are probably going to be setting up multiple of these and needing to try and test different setups. So it's important that you give yourself some space here in these sequence numbers. Okay, and then we talked about the work pools and work priority defaults. These are definitely useful. We recommend that you use them, especially if you're in a paperless picking environment, which we would certainly recommend, not only to save a few trees and help our environment, but also because the warehouse mobile application is specifically designed to be run paperless from a handheld device. So if you are doing that, then you have probably got some system directed or system grouping mobile device menu items set up, and the work pools and the work priorities are going to help you as a warehouse supervisor or your users to know, which work pool are they working in, or which pieces of individual work have the highest priority and need to be done first. So these give you options for when you're assigning or allocating those open pieces of work to your workforce. So you'll see I don't have very many work pools configured in the demo data, but if I assign this web shop work pool to my work template, then every time that the system creates work using this work template, it is going to also assign at the header level of the work this work pool ID. And so now my users would essentially be able to sign in to the web shop work pool on their warehouse mobile application and see all of the open work that needs to be done for that pool of orders. Okay, and then the work priority functions very similarly in that we can give it a default here. Maybe my default for sales orders is 20. And the way that the work priority works is it is on a scale from 0 to 100. And the lower the number, the higher the priority. So a little bit counterintuitive there. But if I would to give it a priority of 100, that does not mean it's the most important. It means it's actually the least important to the system. So we want to make sure we assign a low priority value if it's high priority to our sequencing. So here, if I've given it a value of 20, then every work transaction that's created, again, by this work template as our wave processes, then it will be assigned this value of 20. And that, just again, tells my users which particular pieces of work need to be completed first. So you want to do, your priority 10s and then 20, 30, 40, and so on. So these are also important. They can be modified. So if your work is created with these defaults, you can always go in to the open work queue and see the defaults and go ahead and change them. So I could reassign the work pool if I needed to. That is editable on the work header. I can also reassign the priority value. So if I have a standard priority for all my sales orders, that's the same. But I get an urgent call from customer service that says I've got a particular order that, needs to go out, to make sure we hit a shipping deadline, or we've got an unhappy customer and we're trying to get their order out quickly, then we can, bump up the priority. I can make this a priority 10. And now if all my other sales work is 20, then this one particular pick that I changed to 10 is going to be bumped up to the top of the queue. And the users are going to see that on the warehouse mobile application in real time as soon as I make this change. So the next open piece of work that they do will now be this priority 10. And if you're using the open work lists on the warehouse mobile app, you can sort by these priorities. So that is also very helpful for the users. Okay. And then let's switch back to the work templates just to talk about our last tip, which was the stop work flag. So if I'm looking at the work template, this is a good example here, this 51 pick to staging, because this is the example that we gave earlier in the graphic. So we've got 2 pick put pairs, and you'll see that the stop work flag is checked on this pick here. So what this is basically telling the system is after this first pick and put steps are completed in our workflow, that before the next pick starts, I want you to stop the user from moving on and completing this transaction. So the reason we would do this, specifically in a scenario like this, is for the same reason that I described earlier in the graphic. If we have a pick from inventory and we put it to a staging location, then there may be some activity that needs to happen in that staging location. Maybe I'm doing a visual inspection, a quality check of the inventory that was put there. Maybe I'm waiting on some carrier information to come in, or maybe I'm just simply waiting to accumulate enough inventory to fill up a full trailer to gain some cost efficiencies on my shipping side. Whatever is happening in that intermediate location, I don't want the user to move on to the next set of steps of picking from staging and moving to the bay door until that activity has been done. So without this flag checked, if I uncheck that, and then a work is created using this template, and the user starts to execute this piece of work on the warehouse mobile application, what this is going to look like is it's going to tell them, go pick from your location, go ahead and drop it off in staging, and then pick it right back up from staging and put it to the bay door in one set of transactional steps. And we know that, in the real world, that's really not what's going to happen. So we want to be able to tell the system using this stop work flag. If we enable that, then we are essentially breaking this workflow and allowing there to be that pause. So even if this is the same user who completes the first set of steps and the second set of steps, they have that chance to put the inventory down to the staging location, do whatever needs to be done, and then scan it at a later time or whenever the process needs to be completed. Or this could be a totally different user, right? Maybe you need to hand this off to a quality inspector, and it's actually a different person who's then going to do this movement on the second set of steps. So that is what that flag is for. And that was all of our tips on work templates. So let's move to location directives. So we've got another few tips for you here. The first one is to make sure that we're not creating any unnecessary directives. And what we mean by that is for some work order types, unlike our work templates where our picks and our puts always have to be in pairs, for the location directives, the same is not true. We can create just a pick directive or just a put directive without having the pair to go with it. So the example that I put here is for the purchase order type of location directives. We do not need to create a pick directive because the system knows that the pick is always coming from the default receipt location on the warehouse, because that is where your inventory was registered in order to create the purchase order put away work. So we do not need to create a directive that says pick from, default receipt location, because that's redundant. And then we're just adding processing time to that allocation step that's unnecessary. So all you need to create in that scenario is a put for your purchase orders to tell it, once I pick it up from the receiving location, where does it go in my warehouse? And then also, we've got a multiple SKU flag. So meaning if you are working with many items in a single work transaction, you would want to set this flag to yes, but also use it in addition to a single SKU directive, or meaning a location directive that does not have the multiple SKU flag checked. And again, this is a little bit non-intuitive, but the directives that do not have this flag checked only apply to a single item. If you check the multiple SKU flag, it applies to 2 or more items, so it does not include one. So in order to accommodate both scenarios, using a single item in a transaction or having multiple items in a transaction, then you would need to set up corresponding templates that both have the single SKU, so no flag checked, and then the multiple SKU flag checked in tandem. And we'll look at that because I know that's a bit confusing. And then lastly, just to make sure, and this applies again to the work templates that we just talked about, as well as these location directives. But because we have this sequencing nature to this form, that it's important that you are defining whatever your most specific or most granular criteria is in the first sequence. And then as the sequences go down, that you can start to get more and more general or more broad in your criteria that's being evaluated. And the reason for that is because if you have a very general criteria as the first sequence that's being evaluated, it's going to capture almost all of your scenarios, and none of the other more specific criteria is ever going to get a chance to be evaluated, because the system's going to stop as soon as it finds a match. So let's switch to the system to talk about those quickly. Okay, so I'm going to switch. Again, this is our setup form directly here, but under warehouse management setup, the location directives are not under a submenu like the waves and the work. They are simply under the warehouse management module parameters. They're the second form here. So when you come into the location directives, again, you have all the different types of work you might be working with in a drop down here. So if I look at purchase orders, this is a good example of our first tip, which was if I look at this first one for warehouse 24, all I have got is a put directive. I do not have a pick directive because, again, the system assumes that pick is coming from the default receipt location. So all I need to tell the warehouse is where I am going to go ahead and put this inventory. I'm going to stay on this one because I think we can use it for our other tips. The next one was about using the multiple SKU flag. So you'll see that in the header. So again, as we defined in the graphic, this is the what for the business logic. So what am I doing? I am putting away a purchase order into warehouse 24. And in this case, it's only a single item. If I was doing some type of receiving process, or if I had mixed license plate receiving where I had multiple SKUs on a license plate that is being put away, this directive is not going to apply because this one only allows a single SKU because I don't have this checked. So what you would want to do, and what we mentioned in our tip, is actually I would have another directive that would be, we can call it 24 PO direct multi, and this would be a put. It's in warehouse 24, and this time I can check the multiple SKU flag, and now I have these two different directives that are both for a purchase order put away in warehouse 24. One of them allows me to put away a single item. So if I'm just doing purchase order line receiving and it's a single item, this directive can be used. If I've got that multiple item receiving, or I'm building pallets and doing some sortation on my inbound dock before I do a put away work, then I might have multiple items. Now this directive can be used because I've got the multi-SKU flag checked. Okay, and then the last tip was about making sure that we do our most specific to our most general criteria when we are working with our sequences. So this example here, if I'm still just looking at purchase order put away, this is my single SKU. The how many and which units section in the middle is telling me from 1 to 99,999, does not have a specific unit restricted. So this is just going to be my inventory unit, is going to be directed where at the bottom. If I look at the query, it's saying to my floor location. So that is one specific criteria that I might have. What I'm going to do is add in here a second sequence that instead of just being to the floor location, maybe it's, anywhere in my warehouse, because I want the system to kind of have this catch-all so that work does not fail to allocate, but instead, if it cannot find an available location in the floor locations in my first sequence, that it has a second sequence that is more generic or a more broad criteria where it can find another place to put the inventory outside of those floor locations in the first sequence. So that is what we mean. Let me refresh here. That is what we mean by having a more specific criteria. So that first sequence says only look at floor locations to put my inventory away. The second sequence is not as specific. It basically lets the system evaluate any location within the warehouse to put away. That, you might not go that broad, but just for the sake of our example. So those are our location directive tips. So I'm going to go ahead and go back to our presentation. And I'm going to pause. I know we've got a few minutes left. Zach, is there anything that came up in the Q&A that I can address live?
Hey, Nicole. We got one question, or we have two. We'll see if we have time for them. But one question is, what would happen if there is not enough inventory to reserve? Like, what happens in that scenario?
If there's not sufficient inventory to reserve, then we're really never even going to get to the point where the system is using any of the configurations that we have talked about today, because warehouse management is really dependent on physical inventory being available, so that it can process waves, allocate inventory, and ultimately create work. We don't want to send a warehouse worker to pick an item that is not physically there. So we do not work with like negative inventories in warehouse management.
Mm-hmm. And then another question was, what would happen if there was like 1.3 pallets of good, or an order for, again, more than a pallet, but not full pallet quantities? How would that work in terms of configuring that?
Yeah, that's a great question. So if you have a scenario like that where it's not maybe a clean conversion to full pallets of inventory, let me bring up the like sales order location directives here. You'll see our warehouse 24. This is our picking directive for sales orders. And with this setup here, you'll see we've got two sequences in the middle grid, which is our how many and which units. So we have told it that first evaluate, we've restricted the units to being just a unit of pallet. So if our ordered quantity, our sales order line has a quantity of 130 in your example, and 100 is our full pallet quantity, then it would say, okay, I understand that 130 converts to 100 eaches of one full pallet and then 30 eaches remaining. And it would take that one full pallet of the first 100 eaches, and that meets the criteria of this first sequence. And then it would go down here and say, okay, for that one full pallet, where am I going to pick it from? And in this case, this says pick from our bulk locations. And now with the 30 remaining, it's going to reevaluate this whole directive. So we're going to start over in our sequencing. And now it does not meet the first sequence because it's not a full pallet for 30 remaining. It falls into the second sequence, which is not restricted by any unit. And now we are telling it that it can pick across multiple locations if it needs to. And it can first evaluate my flow rack locations for those 30 eaches. Or if my flow rack is empty, again, we have put kind of a catch-all in here so that we make sure we still create work and go ahead and look anywhere else in the warehouse outside of my flow rack locations to pick the 30 eaches. And then what you're ultimately going to end up with is a piece of work that has two picking lines, a line for a full pallet and then a line for 30 eaches, most likely from different locations, and then a single put to staging or directly to bay door, whatever your work template structure is defining. So that certainly can be accommodated with a setup like this. So thanks. All right, and I think we're right at our hour. So I'm going to go ahead and throw it back to Evan. So thank you for your time, and feel free to reach out to us with any additional questions.
Awesome. Thank you, Nicole. We would like to get your feedback on today's session. I've posted a link to a short survey in the Q&A panel. We value your feedback and welcome your input on how we did today and what you would like to see in future sessions. Again, that survey scores on a scale from 1 to 5, with 5 being the highest score possible, and we thank you for your participation in that. As a reminder, the recording of today's session will be available on the Tech Talks Community Dynamics page within 5 business days. And I'd like to extend a big thank you to our presenter, Nicole, and a thank you to our audience for logging in and joining us today. Please stay safe and have a great rest of your day or evening wherever you are. Goodbye.